So again, welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and we're happy to welcome you tonight to the roundtable on Venezuela, oil, and global politics. I don't think that topic needs a great deal of introduction. I will introduce our panelists. We'll start with Christy Thornton, who is Associate Professor of History at NYU. And also in the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies there. She's the author of Revolution in Development, Mexico and the Governments of the Global Economy, and the former executive director of NACLA, the North American Congress on Land. Second speaker will be Camilo Pérez-Bustillo, who is the co-founder and coordinator of the International Tribunal of Conscience of Peoples in Movement in Mexico City, and a leading translator into English of work by Enrique Dussel, who including the Theological Metaphors of Marx and a number of other works by Dussel, who was both a leading liberation theologian and a leading commentator on the works of Marx, particularly the drafts of Capital. Steve Maher is Assistant Professor of Economics at State University of New York at Cortland, and co-editor of the Socialist Register, and co-author with Scott Aquino of The Fall and Rise of American Finance, as well as the author of Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State. And last but by no means least, Matt Huber, Professor of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University, and the author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, as well as Climate Change as Class War. So each of our guest speakers is going to take about 10 or 12 minutes to discuss the topic at hand from their standpoint. A range of different topics and questions that are going to come up the evening. As we said in the title, we can talk about Venezuela, we can talk about global politics, we can talk about oil, we can talk about, if we must, Donald Trump and the Donroe Doctrine. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 or 12 minutes, then I think they'll have a few things to say to each other, and then we will open it up for questions and comments from everyone here. So, Christy, it's over to you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for having me and for inviting me into this conversation. I was tasked with speaking a little bit about some of the hemispheric responses and how the invasion in Venezuela is reverberating in the rest of the hemisphere. And so I wanted to do that in a little bit of geopolitical perspective and also try to think about what sort of the political economic forces are that are really shaping some of those responses. So I've really been thinking quite a bit in this first few weeks of 2026 about this famous quote from Murray Rothbard that you all will have heard, this quote from 1992, in which he says that the goal of the libertarian movement is, to break the clock of kind of the New Deal state and secure the kind of deregulation that neoliberals have successfully been pushing since the 1970s. But he goes on to say that their goal is more than that their goal is to repeal the 20th century. And I've been thinking a great deal about the idea of the Trump administration attempting to repeal the 20th century this month in particular, when they've made good on the kind of many historical references to McKinley and not just ramped up the kind of tariff war on foes and allies alike, but revived this gunboat diplomacy and desire for naked imperial acquisition. So I think that I've been thinking a lot with that frame of the attempt to repeal the 20th century vis-a-vis U.S. relations with Latin America and what the 20th century, the long sort of arc of U.S. relations with Latin America in the 20th century and what that means in thinking about how Latin America is responding to this Venezuela crisis. I think one of the surprising and perhaps disheartening things has been the lack of a really coordinated response from the Latin American countries to this crisis and to the patently illegal kidnapping of Maduro. And I think it reflects really the fractured state of politics in the region and the economic and military pressure that the Trump administration can bring to bear. Those have really prevented the kind of multilateral denunciation that we might have expected to see and that we have seen in other moments, for example, when Latin America stood very united against the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think one of the reasons for this is that actually popular reaction in the region to the overthrow and capture of Maduro has been surprisingly and dishearteningly mixed. And so there has been a little bit of polling about this, and according to polls, majorities in multiple countries have approved of this action, have approved of the removal of Maduro in this way by U.S. military power. So Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Panama, Peru, Bolivia all registered majority support. That is more than 50% of the population polled saying that they support this action. On the other hand, we see majorities in Mexico and Ecuador in opposition and strong pluralities in Uruguay and Argentina. But there is a kind of groundswell of anti-Maduro feeling and therefore support for this really kind of shocking action. The vast majority of those polled in these same polls show support for the idea of the Venezuelan opposition taking power in Venezuela, which obviously we know has not happened. And so maybe the best wishes of these folks who wanted to see the overthrow of Maduro has not come true. But I do think that kind of popular support for this action and a groundswell of anti-Maduro feeling from, across the population has made a kind of united stance against this kind of gross violation of sovereignty less possible. I think, one of the other things that's obviously going on that we have seen the repercussions of on a day-to-day basis in the region have been these kind of swings between left and right at the presidential level as the kind of post-pink tide struggle between free market and, in the case of Argentina, even sort of radical libertarian forces and those representing left and social movement constituencies. That struggle has continued and indeed even intensified. And I think, today I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about two places that I think are particularly affected by this by virtue of sharing borders with the two countries involved. And those two places are Mexico and Colombia. I think some of the strongest responses from the left have come from both Mexico and Colombia, but also the kind of intense limits of those responses are made clear if we look at what those countries have done in the face of this action. And so thinking about the leadership of Gustavo Petro in Colombia and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, I think is really illustrative of what has been going on here. So, obviously, those of you who have been following this will know that Petro has been very critical of the Trump administration, that he was very critical in the moment when the attacks on the small boats were happening, very vocal about these as violations of international law and violations of Latin American sovereignty. And so in that respect, got into some sort of spats and back and forths with Trump over the course of the way that this conflict has unfolded. Petro, I think, has been the most outspoken of the Latin American leaders. Obviously, Lula has involved as well, but has been the most outspoken of the Latin American leaders in the hemisphere, rejecting the violations of international law and Latin American sovereignty represented by this Venezuela attack. But this, of course, as I said, doesn't go unnoticed in Washington. And so Trump has repeatedly tried to link Petro to drug trafficking, calling Petro at various points an illegal drug leader. And in the aftermath, in the days after the Venezuela attack, Trump was asked if Colombia would be next, to which he responded affirmatively and said in this conversation on Air Force One that Petro should, quote, watch his ass. And so he's made very sort of direct threats on Colombia and on Petro. And so the reason that Colombia emerges as so important, obviously, is because Colombia shares this long border, this 1,300-mile border with Venezuela. And the country, over the course of the last few years, has become home to more than 2.4 million Venezuelans who have fled Venezuela across the border into Colombia, with all sorts of repercussions for not just the border regions, but the major cities in Colombia, et cetera. And so the influx of Venezuelans has already been a sort of political question in Colombia and has really structured the way that Colombia has responded, I think. And so this action will have great consequences for Colombia, regardless of whether or not further military action occurs. So Petro was sort of very much standing up and being very vocal about being against this action in a way that was really defining sort of his place in the hemispheric leadership. And then this sort of very curious thing happened, which was that Petro called a rally, a sort of massive rally in Bogota to get Colombians together to reject this, and that he filled the streets, and there was a huge, and Petro eventually showed up. And when he showed up, he said, I wrote one speech, but now I'm going to have to give you another speech because Trump and I just talked on the phone. And in fact, we're trying to work it out. And so there was a moment when people really wanted Petro to sort of shoulder a sort of anti-imperialist Latin American movement. And in fact, he and Trump had a conversation on the phone in which the sort of material and geopolitical conditions, the threats that Trump can really make very real, I think, became very apparent. And so they have decided that they're going to try to work together. Petro has been invited to the White House in February 3rd, so he'll be here in a couple of weeks, and we'll see what the outcome of that meeting is. And, this is the first time that he's coming as his presidency is quickly coming to an end. People might not know that Colombia is in the middle of an election season. Colombia will hold both legislative and presidential elections in March and May, respectively. And so the question of the way that this reverberates in Colombian politics, I think, is important. Whatever Petro does, he's only in office for until this election in 6 months. And so right now, the kind of two top contenders, as we have seen across the region, to replace him are a representative of his kind of left movement, Ivan Cepeda. He is allied with Petro being the first leftist to govern Colombia really since, the killing of Gaitan in 1948 was the last moment at which there could have been a leader like this. And so he represents a real sea change in many cases in sort of Colombian relationships with the United States. And so there is a contender who is on the left similarly. And then there is an extremely right-wing libertarian contender who models himself as the Colombian Nayib Bukele, referring to, of course, the Salvadoran strongman who rules with kind of mano dura in El Salvador and who's overseen the creation of this massive prison to which the Trump administration has been deporting people, the SECOC prison in El Salvador. And so the Venezuela situation could, in fact, have a really important impact on this election if the conditions in Colombia deteriorate because of what's happening in Venezuela in one way or another, right? Regardless of what the Trump administration decides to do vis-a-vis Colombia itself, there could be really important implications for Colombian politics, given that they are in the middle of this election season. And so one of the ways that this has sort of sprung up in very recent days has been Petro has been seen to really start taking a hard stance with one of the remaining guerrilla movements that has been operating in the border region and also in Venezuela, the ELN, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional. And Petro has basically, given that he's tried to include them in the peace process, they have decided not to do that, and he has now sort of given them an ultimatum. And so that question, the ELN is itself designated as a terrorist organization by the Trump administration in its kind of move to make narco-terrorism a target for legitimate military action. And so that question of what happens with the ELN, what happens on the Colombia-Venezuela border, is a really important question for these remaining days of Petro's administration and for whatever will happen in Colombia going forward. So we'll see what happens when Petro visits Washington in 2 weeks. But this is in the waning days of his presidency. And so whatever rapprochement he's able to build sort of personally with Trump, which is something that, various leaders have been able to do, could really be very much upset by whatever happens in the election and over the next few months. I'll briefly speak to Mexico as well. And that is another place where we see many of these same things happening. The threats against Mexico, the threats to send in the military, the designation of drug trafficking organizations as terrorists, et cetera. And also the ability of the leader in the person of Claudia Sheinbaum to really sort of manage Trump's ego and try to seek some sort of attempt to hold his worst threats at bay. In Mexico, we know that the Trump administration not only designated these a set of drug trafficking groups as terrorists, but he made this declaration that fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction, which is just an incredible phrase to use for someone like Trump, who campaigned theoretically, being on the sort of failures of the Iraq War to then manufacture his own weapon of mass destruction to try to go after. And, that is part of the whole kind of very spurious and honestly ridiculous DOJ case against Maduro has to do with drug trafficking. And obviously we know that fentanyl is not coming from Venezuela. And so part of the whole thing that surprises me about all of this, and I don't know if my comrades here will have anything to say about this, is just how flimsy the DOJ case is. And so the decision to actually bring Maduro to the United States to try him when the actual case against him is just nonsense. It is really something that has me scratching my head. Back to Mexico to think about this. So, Mexico, many of these drug trafficking organizations, including Sinaloa, et cetera, are mentioned in the indictment of Maduro. So there are explicit attempts to link Maduro to these Mexican drug trafficking organizations through the kind of specter of the quote unquote narco terrorist. And so that puts Mexico very directly in the crosshairs of what's happening here, in addition to all the kind of like explicit threats that have been made. And so the New York Times got some off the record commentary from some people in Sheinbaum's administration demonstrating, for example, how closely they were tracking in the aftermath of the Venezuela invasion, Trump's various mentions of Mexico. Every time somebody in the Trump administration said something about Mexico, the people around Sheinbaum were paying very close attention. And so there was a real ramping up in the immediate aftermath. And then now, as we've gotten into the Greenland insanity, they have sort of forgotten about Mexico for a moment, but I think we can expect it to come back. Trump has repeatedly over the course of this term, and he did this in the previous term, offered the use of the U.S. military to combat drug trafficking in Mexico. And it's something to her credit that Sheinbaum has repeatedly rebuffed. U.S. boots on the ground in Mexico is very much a bright line and has been for literally decades in Mexico. But I think that here, the kind of questions of political economy and the close integration of these two economies really make clear the limits within which Sheinbaum and Morena are working more generally. And so, for those who are less familiar with Mexico, something like 80% of Mexico's exports come to the United States. And so that gives Trump massive leverage when he's talking about his kind of various tariff wars, the kind of levers that he can use. And so with this exposure, tariffs that do exist hit especially hard. And so Trump has used this to extract real concessions from Mexico, including this new 50% tariff on Chinese goods, including BYD electric cars, that went into effect at the beginning of this year. China has been in recent years the second largest exporter to Mexico after the US, but it buys almost no Mexican goods. So Mexico does not export to China in the same way. And so Sheinbaum has denied that this tariff is about appeasing Trump and sort of pushing back on the pressure, of any kind of intervention. And it is deeply true that China and Mexico have been stiff competitors in many regards since China entered the WTO. And so she has a plausible case to make, and she has been making a case about boosting domestic manufacturing as the cause of this kind of new tariff on Chinese goods. But she is also keeping Trump happy under the threat of further tariff action. And so that is one way that Sheinbaum has really pursued that kind of goal. And another thing that she has done is to ramp up some of the more visible and spectacular drug enforcement operations, including sending last year more than 50 drug traffickers sought by the DOJ in the United States to the U.S. to stand trial, including someone like Rafael Caro Quintero, who was implicated in the 1985 killing of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. Just yesterday, in fact, the Sheinbaum administration sent another 37 people to stand trial on drug charges in the United States. And so that is very much obviously a way that the Sheinbaum administration is responding. There's also the question of humanitarian aid in the form of oil, which is going to Cuba. Cuba is now under intense pressure, obviously, with the Venezuelan oil cutoff. So I do think that that's one place where the kind of continued insistence on Cuba opens up another kind of problem for Mexico. I'm running out of time, so I will just quickly sum up by saying, there is, of course, we don't know what's happening covertly. These leaders have thus far managed to keep kind of overt military action from coming to their countries after Venezuela. But the CIA gave testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee saying that they have 61% more agents on the ground now. We just don't know what the kind of covert action is happening on these levels. And that kind of cooperation has long been very important to U.S. administrations, security cooperation. And it is just very clear that Trump doesn't care about cooperation. He doesn't care whether countries want to maintain their good relationships in that way. So that is another sort of problem for Sheinbaum. I'll just finish by saying, as a historian of Mexico and thinking again about the kind of long history of this kind of US Latin American engagement, the United States has a very long history of asserting its place in the world vis-a-vis its relationship with Latin America, as the work of people like Greg Grandin and others have shown. And I'm reminded very strongly in this moment of the moment after World War I, when the United States was having an internal debate about whether to join the League of Nations. And because I've done a little bit of research about this, I found that, in fact, the debate about whether the United States should join this multilateral institution was frequently about whether the United States would continue to have unilateral prerogative in the problem spots in Latin America, which at that point were revolutionary Mexico. And so the idea after World War I, there was this real move made by a very vociferous and vocal set of legislators that was referred to as the Mexico Next movement. And the invasion of Mexico would sort of solve the United States problems. And I think that that is a trope that we have seen repeating over and over again. And I'm sure it's something that the Sheinbaum administration is thinking about and that we all need to continue to watch. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Christy. And I'm realizing our 10 to 12 minute limit is probably a little unrealistic because there's so much to say. So I'll relax the strictures a bit and ask our speakers to try to keep to 15 minutes going forward. Camilo Pérez-Bustillo, please take it away.
Thank you. I'm honored to join you. I'm sorry, I just having some throat issues here tonight. I'm honored to join you tonight from Mexico City, and Christy has laid out the landscape really masterfully. What I want to try to do is both kind of zoom out and zoom in. I want to first contextualize what I want to try to bring to the table that essentially complements what Christy has again introduced so helpfully. I'm here on behalf of a network of Latin American human rights defenders and jurists who've joined together over the last 15 years to form an international people's tribunal to address serious human rights crimes that include cases such as the recent US intervention in Venezuela and those looming threats that Christy has laid out against Colombia, against Cuba, against Mexico, as well as, and this is kind of the connection, the bridge I want to kind of lay out for us, as well as the equivalent and related terror that's currently unfolding against migrant communities and families in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in LA, and elsewhere throughout the US, especially as we're on the eve of these really important mobilizations and convenings in Minneapolis and in solidarity with the people of Minneapolis throughout the US, and not just inside the US, beyond, right here in Mexico City. This tribunal, in its first phase, will be organizing a series of public hearings throughout Latin America, from Argentina all the way here to Mexico, throughout the next year, but also this will include hearings throughout the US, focusing on these issues, culminating in a binational hearing at the US-Mexico border in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, in September, and in Mexico City in November. So I'm kind of speaking from there, kind of as somebody involved in pulling this together. But I'm also speaking in personal terms, and I want to kind of just share that positioning. This is what Enrique Dussel, who's an important inspiration in terms of my own thinking and work and how I'm approaching these issues tonight, would frame this. He used to talk about el lugar de enunciación, sort of the place of enunciation from which we position ourselves as a philosopher, as a historian, as a theologian, as a historian. How do we come to this? How do we come to this forum tonight? I come here as an international human rights lawyer, as a law professor, as an activist, who's the child of migrants from Colombia. So I have both Colombian and US nationality. So everything that Christy sketched out, which was, I think, very well founded about Colombia's dilemmas in navigating all of the ripple effects, the repercussions from what has just begun to unfold as to Venezuela are very important to keep in mind, but also have a deep significance for me personally. Some of my earliest childhood memories are in the streets of Bogota's historical center, with in the hands of my father, hearing the speeches of Bolivar that he had learned by heart as a child himself, teaching them to me and sort of commending to me the legacy of Bolivar, something that I think it's difficult for many of us who are accustomed to looking at things from the US and maybe at looking at what's going on in Venezuela and Latin America at this moment to understand is the centrality of the figure and the vision of Simon Bolivar, which many of you may associate more concretely and specifically with Venezuela. After all, it's the Bolivarian revolution that's associated with Venezuela, with Hugo Chavez, and then most recently with the Maduro regime and with what's going down in Venezuela as we speak. But Simon Bolivar is sort of the founding father, not just of 6 distinct nations in Latin America, but of really the subcontinent in a broader sense. But beyond that, of much of what we understand, when Christy talks about the current disjointedness, let's say, of the Latin American response to US aggression and to what may come next, that's exactly what Bolivar was seeking to respond to in the 1820s when the Monroe Doctrine was first enunciated. Christy also mentioned what I would say is the indispensable work of Greg Grandin, among others, but let's focus on Greg Grandin for a moment in his most recent book, America, where he reconstructs some of this history in a very compelling way. Specifically, this part about understanding the context of the Monroe Doctrine and how Bolivar sought to respond to the Monroe Doctrine. So when we ask ourselves today, as Christy, I think, was, how Latin American countries, including Venezuela's neighbors, are responding to US terror and aggression in Venezuela and the continuing threats beyond, it's, again, the same question that Bolivar posed in the 1820s. The form that response took, again, the challenge was the Monroe Doctrine, which had initially a, quote, anti-imperialist impulse because its immediate emphasis was to send a message to the former European colonial powers that were in retreat from the continent because of the struggle for emancipation of the emerging South American nations, to know that they were not welcome, that they could not return to the hemisphere and seek to reestablish their dominance, the Spanish, the Portuguese in particular, but also, of course, in the case of the US, the British. But what was not so clear, but that Bolivar foresaw, and he wrote about this passionately and eloquently, was how the US already looked like it was preparing to step into the role of the former European colonial powers and would replace them in terms of its hegemonic pretensions. And that's what the Monroe Doctrine became. Rather than directed at the former European colonial powers, it became directed at establishing US dominance in the region. That's what Bolivar sought to respond to through the project of continental unity that became a call for a Congress to be held in what is now Panama in 1826 that would lay the foundation for what later became essentially the principles of international law that lay the basis first for the League of Nations and then for the UN. So forgive me if I got into the weeds there a little bit in terms of international law and so on. But when we talk about the US intervention and invasion of Panama, of Panama, by the way, in 1989, but of Venezuela these last few weeks as being illegal, we're talking about those same principles. Those principles have a Latin American origin. And it's in that original Bolivarian vision. So this didn't start with Hugo Chavez, much less with the Maduro regime or the Bolivarian Revolution as it's currently understood. This began back in the 1820s and before that. So just to give us a little context. But let me, with the remaining time I have in this first block, try and talk about the connections between these two complementary dimensions and mechanisms of US terror that I've alluded to. What I want to emphasize is that from the perspective of people of Latin American origin within the US and beyond, the terror in the streets of Caracas and the terror in the streets of Minneapolis or Chicago or LA is in essence the same. It's worth noting in this context how there's always, for some reason, this missing dimension as to migrants when we talk about these issues. For one thing, it's worth underlining that migrants of Venezuelan origin, along with Haitians and Somalis, have been among those targeted, stigmatized, and singled out most systematically for persecution and especially abusive treatment during the last year and throughout the last few months, weeks, and days. It's also important to underline how US policies, the universal coercive measures as we understand them under international law, or sanctions as they're commonly referred to in the Venezuelan case, imposed by the US on the Venezuelan regime, have played a direct role in actively promoting the massive processes of forced migration. They've been the root causes, quote unquote, which Kamala Harris had a hard time finding, which have resulted in an exodus of millions of Venezuelans, not only to the US, but throughout Latin America. We don't have to look very far if we dig a little bit in history for explorations of this kind of relationship between external terror and domestic terror. I want to suggest two important historical analogies, and probably my time will run out at that point in terms of this first block. One, we've just been engaged throughout the US and beyond. Here in Mexico City, we were honoring Dr. King also, not just in the US. And Dr. King very powerfully understood the connection between the US war in Vietnam, racism, and domestic social injustice in the 1960s. The triple evils, as he referred to them, of militarism, racism, and capitalism that he highlighted in his Riverside Church speech on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination. And he and Coretta Scott King referred to the way in which, this is the phrase that many of you may recall, or if not, we should go back and reflect about it, how the bombs in Vietnam explode at home. Coretta Scott King, 3 weeks after his murder in Central Park to 100,000 people, said, keeping a date that she had committed to despite his assassination, said, "The bombs we drop on the people of Vietnam continue to explode at home with all of their devastating potential. She said, "My husband always saw the problem of racism and poverty here at home and militarism abroad as two sides of the same coin. In fact, it's even clear that our policy at home is to try to solve social problems through military means, just as we have done abroad, like in the streets of Minneapolis." And then she said, "The interrelatedness of domestic and foreign affairs is no longer questioned." What's incredible is how we've gone backwards in understanding that was so obvious then. The other analogy is to the 1840s and 1850s between the abolitionist movement, abolitionist as to slavery. Today we have an abolitionist movement too, from the perspective of immigrant rights, of course, as to ICE and as to the Border Patrol, and I would underline as to borders themselves, and ultimately as to nation states. And I think we should talk about all that. That, I would argue, is an epistemological and political break that is on the agenda. And we can come back to all that and what Latin America teaches us about that, what Latin American revolutionary movements teach us about all that. But we'll come back to that. But what I wanted to stress is that about the abolitionist movement of the 1840s and 1850s, what they clearly understood, just like Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, in terms of the connection of their, quote, domestic struggle to abolish chattel slavery and the US's imperial impulses at that historical moment in terms of the South's interest in expanding slavery, first to Texas, and then through the filibuster and freebooting movement, William Walker and others, to Nicaragua, and through the proposed annexation of Cuba, because of course at that point, Cuba under Spanish colonial rule that had persisted still had slavery. What they understood was that the Mexican War was a vehicle for expanding slavery. And so they opposed the Mexican War in those terms. And so they understood that there was no separation. And in fact, there was a deep connection between their resistance to the war in Mexico and to the attempt to expand slavery through freebooting and filibustering William Walker and so on in Nicaragua, and the proposed annexation of Cuba, and then later of what became the Dominican Republic. They clearly understood that it was the same struggle. How come it's so hard for us to understand that today?
Okay, Camilo, thanks very much for drawing out those connections. We're on to Matt Hubert to shift the topic somewhat to petroleum, fossil capitalism, if you will, and resource imperialism.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to start by saying it's just crazy how we planned to do this event a couple weeks ago, and it seems like this week it's in the past, and the crisis is on to a completely different continent, really. And but I really appreciate what the previous two speakers have said to kind of contextualize what we're facing and the stakes. I want to talk about oil, and I kind of want to make the case that the idea that this conflict is about oil is a bit overstated, and I do find it's a hard case to make when Donald Trump basically can't stop talking about how the conflict was really all about oil. And there was a great line by a scholar, I think, at Tufts University in the Financial Times, where he made the case that he thinks that Rubio, who has much more ideological reasons to want Maduro out, sort of staunch anti-communism, that Rubio kind of used oil to kind of get Trump on board as a pretext. And the scholar said that I don't doubt that Trump thinks it's about oil, but he's wrong. I thought, and I actually think that's correct. So I want to kind of talk about what interest U.S. oil capital would have in this particular invasion and kidnapping of Maduro. And I think Trump has this idea that the big major oil companies like ExxonMobil and Conoco and others are going to sort of go into Venezuela and invest to revive the oil sector. And I think we have to just look at the context of the global political economy of oil at the moment and note that oil capitalists are really not interested in investing unless they're going to make profits, right? And the problem with the oil market right now is it is actually quite oversupplied, and oil prices are historically depressed and rather low. Last I checked, about $60 a barrel. And of course, the problem with Venezuelan oil is it is a particular, most of it, although they have a variety of different reserves, but most of it is very heavy oil and very difficult to extract, which means The Economist actually suggested that the break-even price for profitable extraction of oil in Venezuela right now, particularly for this heavy oil in the Arinco belt, is $80 a barrel, right? So it's not even it's borderline unprofitable to even go in there and produce this particular oil, which I think is why ExxonMobil in there, when Trump summoned all the oil executives to the White House, and when ExxonMobil just flat out called Venezuela uninvestable, right? And there's a lot of other reasons why they believe that. Now, to be fair, I think, Chevron is the major U.S. oil company that actually has stuck it out in Venezuela and has a significant amount of sunk capital there, and I think does stand to gain from this, whatever you want to call. I still don't think the U.S. is running the country per se, but they're there and they're really setting the terms of what happens to that oil. And I think Chevron is also very keen on getting back a lot of wealth they feel was expropriated under the Chavez regime. So that's something going on. There's also, as you've probably heard, these refineries on the Gulf Coast that are specialized in processing this heavy oil. But from what I understand, those refineries have plenty of that heavy oil from Canada, and basically unleashing Venezuela's oil might lower the price of that heavy oil by a few dollars, but it's not a game changer. These are not oil interests that you could argue are so overwhelming in trying to push for a case of invasion and kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. So again, what I'm trying to make, I don't think this is really something that was done at the behest of the oil companies, or that the oil companies were even aware that this was going to happen, even though Trump claims he told them, even though he didn't tell Congress, but he told them. Now, the other major thing that structures, particularly U.S. oil companies, whether they're going to invest in other nations, is they are very concerned about what they call political risk, and particularly political stability in the countries because they want there to be clear legal frameworks, clear rules and regimes for taxes and royalties and all this stuff. And obviously, at this point, there's nothing close to political stability in Venezuela. I mean, just the fact that Donald Trump claims that they're running the country, the fact that he did not do a regime change. In fact, he just took out the leader, and the same regime is in place. And that regime is still, for whatever it's worth, filled with Chavista, Maduro-aligned socialists, right? Which is also not something private capitalist oil companies are keen. Exxon also said recently that they're like, we've been expropriated twice in Venezuela already. Why would we come back, right? So that this is not a favorable political environment for these oil companies to go into. Um, Now, the last thing that I think is a much broader set of political, sort of like a political base for MAGA and the Trump coalition in the United States, is not just these big oil companies like ExxonMobil, but it's like the wider network of smaller, what are called independent oil companies, small refining companies, and also all the oil workers and the kind of oil complex that makes up much of the country. And that complex is really invested in a lot of the shale oil production in the United States, the fracking. But the problem with that is it's also very high cost and is really at risk of becoming unprofitable if oil prices decline. In fact, from what I've seen, the break-even price for shale oil production in places like Texas right now is about 65, which we are now below. And so those oil companies also do not want a flood of Venezuelan oil coming onto the oil market and then further supplying an already oversupplied market. And of course, that if that were to happen, it would really decimate what you would think is like one of the core fulcrums of the MAGA coalition, and they're already, I think, not thrilled with the conditions that already exist because Trump is all about drill baby drill, but he's really not really keen on raising the price of oil because of the affordability crisis and all that. So they're kind of suffering already. And so, it just brings up a general problem with the political economy of oil that has always struck me when I did my dissertation on it a couple decades ago, is that the problem for particularly over the last I guess like 150 years, the problem for the political economy of oil is too much oil, or surplus, or glut, and markets oversupplied, where prices are too low to facilitate profitable investment. And we've kind of, there was a big boom with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that was a sort of blip. And for the last 10 years, really, sort of incidentally, right after Chavez died, you had the collapse of oil prices and a really kind of depressed oil prices and oil market for the last decade, I would say. And so this is not favorable conditions for, what Trump is talking about, like a flood of oil investment in these very unfavorable conditions in Venezuela. So, then the question is, what the heck is this about, right? And I just wanted to talk about oil, so I'm not really gonna say much about that. But I do think it brings up questions that I think Steve will probably have more smart things to say about how we think about the relationship between the state, the capitalist state, and capital. And I think, again, what I'm trying to push back against is this sort of simplistic, that someone called instrumentalist theory, that the oil companies they have Trump's ear, they control the Trump administration, and they lobbied for this invasion, so now they can get all the oil in Venezuela, make all the money, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I don't think that's what's going on. It seems clear to me that this is, I would argue, a much more sort of geopolitical, ideological struggle on the part of the Trump administration to assert this sort of power over our hemisphere or whatever. And again, I think I did like the term that Adam Tooze used for Trump. He called it cosplay resource imperialism. And I do think Trump likes spectacular, made-for-TV type of events. And that's what this was, And those of us that woke up, wasn't it a Saturday morning to woke up and saw like, what? Like 150 U.S. fighter jets, how many, I don't know how many exactly, special forces descending on Caracas, kidnapping a leader, bringing them to Brooklyn. I mean, this is Trump media magic, right? And of course, I think, again, Rubio, his anti-communism, his long-standing hostility to not just the regime of Venezuela, but Cuba, is clearly part of what's going on. But then the question then becomes, well, what what is the role of capital at all in this kind of stuff? And I'm kind of puzzled on that question. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that the Trump administration does where you could argue that there's not a lot of capitalists really asking for this, right? Just this morning, I was reading Howard Lutnick's op-ed in the Financial Times, where he's like, "We're coming to Davos to destroy the status quo." Like, that's what, I mean, that he's like evincing a hostility to global neoliberal capitalism. It's sort of stunning, and I feel like the left could have taken that lane. I'm really sad we didn't, and now we have people like Howard Lutnick taking that lane. So this makes me think that there's just something really dark and ideological going on with this state we have right now. And the term I tried to come up with, and I'm not sure it works, but we talk a lot in Marxist state theory about the relative autonomy of the state from capital, which suggests that the state can never really be fully autonomous from capital. But whatever this state is it suggests something that I call the absolute autonomy of capital. Like, they're just doing things that don't particularly seem in the interest of capital at all, and just seem also part of this sort of very weird media generated spectacular ideological types of actions. So, and I would say oil definitely is involved in that, like this almost purely spectacle discourse. But in terms of like oil interest and the political economy and oil companies, I don't think it has much to do with oil. So I will stop there, and thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And I think your final comments there may have provoked Steve Maher. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. No, it's great. And Matt's comments, first of all, thanks for having me, Fred. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks to the MVP, and thanks to the previous presenters for their insightful comments, which I definitely learned from listening to you guys, and very glad to be part of this conversation. Matt did indeed touch off, pretty much right where I want to pick up, and that is to talk a bit about global capitalism and global political economy, because unlike in 1823, when the U.S. enunciated the Monroe Doctrine, and it was barely a regional power, it is today a global empire, which is quite a different situation. And so to then articulate a Monroe Doctrine, which I find to be an absolutely appalling neologism, almost makes me sick to say it, actually, to be honest. But to be articulating a Monroe Doctrine almost seems to be a retreat, perhaps. And so I think this is kind of the terrain that a lot of this discussion of the U.S. empire has kind of taken place on. To start with, though, I think we can notice that if Trump won, was an incredibly shocking apparent reversal of decades of imperial policy in which the U.S. has basically been oriented toward constructing an integrated global capitalism stitched together by the free movement of capital, the free movement of investment internationally, creating for the first time in the decades after World War II, a truly integrated global capitalism, a singular global capitalism, not regional capitalisms, not competing imperial systems, but one integrated global capitalist order. Trump, too, has been even more of an affront to that general orientation that the U.S. state has maintained in those decades. Not only is he challenging global integration and talking about and imposing tariffs and so on, but he's literally now talking about annexing Greenland, annexing a territory. He threatened to annex Canada. Now, of course, we might not take all these threats so seriously, but clearly a direct challenge or a very sharp reversal of the informal nature of the U.S. empire, in which it is kind of comprised of formally independent, relatively autonomous states. So, how are we supposed to understand where this is coming from? How do we understand the shocking statements and actions of Trump 1 and even more drastic, more shocking actions of Trump 2? Well, the common framing that we hear is that this is a matter of U.S. decline. The American empire, the American economy is declining. And as the American economy declines, Trump is somehow a morbid symptom of this decline, an attempt to reverse it, an attempt to shore up the US global position. And these arguments typically rely on two assumptions that are really, really important and fundamental to making those arguments. The first is that what we call economism in Marxist state theory, the idea that the actions of the capitalist state are reducible to simple effects of the economy. So there is no actual autonomous space for the political. Everything that the state does in every detail is simply an extension or an effect of some economic process or economic logic. So there's no space for politics really at all. And the second component, the second assumption that these arguments rely on is what we might call instrumentalism, which Matt mentioned earlier. So you have a situation in which the state acts at the behest, the direct command of particular capitalists. So it doesn't have any distance or any independence from the interests and commands even of individual firms. It simply executes the will of particular capitalists. And so together we have economism and instrumentalism, right? The economy is in decline, and because the economy is in decline, capitalists act through the state via Trump to reverse that decline and take these kind of drastic international actions in the global stage. Now, I think these assumptions don't hold, and I think that they actually fundamentally misdiagnose what we're observing right now. And so, for example, you can start by noticing that Trump was not the favorite of most of big business. It was Harris. And in fact, the crisis itself stems in part precisely from the fact that capital does not control the state. Had capital controlled the state, the outcome of the last election would have gone differently. What we see instead is a situation in which there's a relatively autonomous state that is also formally democratic. And the formally democratic nature of that state invited a populist backlash against the costs of globalization. So capital was benefiting from globalization. It is profiting hand over fist. U.S. corporations are making record profits. We see U.S. business certainly strongly in favor of continuing the general global integration process that we've seen since World War II, and had no interest in reversing that process or engaging in the kinds of conflicts with its closest allies that Trump has made a hallmark of his international public policy. So capital preferred Harris. But the formally democratic nature of that state meant that the populist backlash that was the result of the costs imposed by the strength of capital was able to be expressed through this formally democratic state. So it was the strength of capital that relied on crushing the working class, decimating industrial regions, declining labor share of national income, huge expansion of the surplus populations domestically. Roughly 35% of the working age adult population in the United States is currently without employment. That includes people who are counted within official unemployment figures as well as those who are not. So we're talking about a population roughly the size of Canada that is currently without employment. And so the massive costs of globalization on the American working class created the basis for a populist backlash that could be expressed within the formally democratic structure of the American state. And therefore, this guy came to power that was by no means the favorite of capital, but nevertheless was able to command the machinery of the state and to take hold of the executive, which has the autonomy of which has been significantly built up since the 1970s, especially precisely in order to execute the globalization agenda. So in order to protect the liberalization project, in order to protect the globalization orientation of the American state from potential backlash, the executive branch of the American state has had a significant extension, a significant amount of autonomy built up around it. And Trump has been able to use that autonomy that was built up to protect that globalization project in order to now challenge the globalization project and implement an agenda that is quite different than what capital might prefer. So because of the unique international role of the United States, because of the ongoing centrality of the United States, a political crisis that afflicts the American state immediately also becomes a crisis of global capitalism. It becomes a crisis of the entire world order that afflicts each and every individual capitalist state that is a member of the US empire. That's what it means to be an imperial power. So this political crisis that emerged from the delegitimation of capitalism among the American electorate then becomes a global political crisis. And Trump is acting in ways that are not functional to the reproduction of global capitalism, as we've seen that carried out since World War II. And the primary effect of this has been to accelerate process of fragmentation and disorganization of power within the American empire that Trump didn't create, but he has significantly pushed that forward. So we've seen in the recent past, I would argue, a significant fragmentation of power within the context of the American empire. And so the American state has been gradually evolving into a global position in which it is no longer the unipolar power in the world system, but is still the primary power. So it has lost unipolarity, but not primacy. And to some extent, this is the result of the challenges and the contradictions of managing an empire in which you are having to organize a consensus among states that are formally independent. That involves all kinds of contradictions. And the process of economic development that has gone on since World War II has meant that a larger range of voices and interests are now demanding a say in the rules of world order that the American state is uniquely responsible for developing and implementing. And so there is a fragmentation going on. The United States, the American state maintaining primacy, but not unipolarity. Trump comes to power and is inserted into this historical process that pre-exists him and has now, because of his ineptitude and strategic mismanagement of the role of the president of the American empire, has extended that process tremendously, such that the crisis that we're now experiencing is no longer simply a crisis of legitimation. It's a much deeper and more significant crisis of the American empire than just the delegitimation of capitalism within the United States. Now, at the same time, the American state still anchors world money, and it still anchors global accumulation. So one of the more interesting question to me than is the American state in decline is rather why, in the context of this extreme rattling of the foundations of empire that we've seen over the past year and in the previous Trump presidency, why is it that the American state still remains so powerful, still remains so central within the world economy? Why is it that the decisions and ineptitude and chaos of the American president still has such significant global ramifications, right? And one reason for that is because the American state still anchors global accumulation and the global monetary system. The U.S. dollar is still central. There are no current rivals or alternatives to the US dollar as a form of world money, right? China's financial system is controlled very tightly by the state. The renminbi lacks the liquidity that could allow it to serve as world money. Russia is a relatively small economy that is more likely to emerge as a Chinese satellite than anything else. Europe, as has become abundantly clear, is incredibly dependent on the US. It lacks an internal fiscal union, and it's wrapped by internal political tensions and conflicts. And indeed, Japan, the UK, and the EU have all agreed to sign very unfavorable trade deals at the instigation and bullying of Donald Trump. So the US still remains central to global accumulation, even despite this crisis of the US empire that we're clearly witnessing. Perhaps the foremost dilemma that the US faces in the context of this trajectory toward fragmentation and disorganization that I'm describing has been the challenge of containing China, right? Containing China is incredibly difficult for the US because decoupling from China is not a plausible option, right? Unlike in the interwar period, unlike in the World War I period and lead up to World War I, we don't have a system of inter-imperial rivalry where separate independent capitalist empires are contesting over economic territory, each trying to control colonies for the exclusive exploitation of their own capitalist classes, right? We have an integrated global capitalist order, which means that China, being very thoroughly integrated within that global capitalist order, can't simply be contained very easily. It's incredibly difficult to do that. The US can't easily decouple from China. China can't easily decouple from the US, right? So the challenge then of managing China and containing China in the context in which decoupling is not on the agenda is incredibly contradictory and difficult and prone to all kinds of disorder and even potential warfare. The one way we can see this is that foreign direct investment. So one thing we see very often is people pointing to the rising productivity of labor in China, and that's been the engine of Chinese economic development as a sign that the U.S. is in decline. But in fact, the chief beneficiaries of that rising productivity of the Chinese economy and Chinese labor are American multinational corporations. Right? American FDI from American MNCs has continued to flow into China precisely because they are benefiting from those productivity gains in China, right? That value, what we call relative surplus value, is flowing right back into the coffers of those American firms. So the linkage between the US and China remains very strong, and decoupling isn't really an option. So tariffs, I would argue, were really about balancing Trump trying to navigate the contradictions between a still very strong American capitalist class, which is still whose liberalization, whose globalization is deeply entrenched on the one hand, and the demands of his working class base on the other. And the way that he attempted to do that was to basically use tariffs as a way of adjusting the costs and benefits of empire. Right? To use nationalism and the promise of expanded manufacturing employment to appease the working class base, while also using tariffs as a weapon to deepen market access, expand liberalization of other states, use them as a lever to force other states to further liberalize and enhance the market access for American multinationals. So it would be a win-win for both American multinationals and workers, right? And of course, that was a very, very difficult needle to thread, and it failed, right? I think it's clear at this point that Trump's attempt to use tariffs to engineer this kind of coalition domestically has not worked. So Trump has had to back down in all the critical areas in order to accommodate the strength of capital when it comes to tariffs. The other important factor, I think, is the tremendous expansion of American military power. And I think when you see declinist accounts, very often people just kind of thoughtlessly say, oh, well, the use of American military power is bound to be self-defeating. It's kind of an illusion. Sure, they're going to use the military, but it's destined to undermine itself. It surely can't succeed. It surely can't actually have an impact on global politics. But I think that there's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to believe that the expansion of American coercive dominance internationally is going to be self-defeating, at least in the short run. We saw this in the Middle East, right? In the previous round of American imperial violence in Trump 2, where basically the United States and its very close ally Israel effectively carried out and brought about a state of affairs that the neocons 20 years ago could barely have dreamed, right? They wiped out every single one of the major opposing forces to American Israeli power in the region. The U.S. directly bombed Iran. They executed regime change in Syria. They carried out what would be considered the ultimate third rail of Middle East politics, a genocide against the Palestinian people, which has typically been the absolute center of any remaining Arab nationalism that persists in the region, carried over from the 1960s. So as a result of this, Israel is now in the most powerful position in the Middle East. It's been since 1967. So the neocon dream has effectively been realized there, at least for now. The second area is, of course, Latin America. The Donroe Doctrine, a new era of direct and much more muscular imperialism to confront China, to increase tremendously the cost to capitalists and capitalist states across the region of doing business with China, and to try to root out significantly growing Chinese influence and trade relations in Latin America. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that, at least for now, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela that we're talking about has had the desired effect in Latin America, putting a significant chill and executing significant deterrence to developing closer relationships with China. And of course, in Europe, right, so-called abandoning Europe, what abandoning Europe has actually meant is a more coercive and bullying orientation toward the European states that have hitherto been the closest American allies in the world. And of course, Europe has absolutely no alternative but to, as Vijay Prashad said recently, run back to daddy, right? Europe has absolutely no plan B to continuing to trust in American military hegemony. And that is absolutely clearly on display across the board as Europe bends over backwards to appease and accommodate Trump, no matter how outrageous his demands become, including literally invading and attacking a NATO ally in the case of Denmark over Greenland. So they've taken advantage of the weakness of left regimes in Europe. They have left regimes in Latin America. They have expanded U.S. Israeli power across the Middle East, and they have tremendously extended their dominance over Europe and the subjugation of Europe. There's also the question that emerges in Trump's national security strategy of the development of the so-called fascist international, where U.S. foreign policy is apparently going to be oriented around reorganizing global politics around a core group of hard right regimes in Europe, and also encouraging the strengthening of hard right neo-fascist forces across states in which they haven't yet taken power. So that, I think, is also a very significant factor potentially in the orientation that the Trump regime has taken toward Latin America. Again, taking advantage of the weakness of the remaining left regimes in Latin America. The other question, of course, not at all in the background, but I'm sure, if not for Trump, in the foreground of the minds of at least some military planners, because, of course, Trump is not an individual, but is just an individual. The state is not reducible to Trump as just an individual, but Trump has acted in a concerted way to empower the most hawkish, extreme elements across the security and military establishment, and that is climate change. There is absolutely no doubt that, especially given Trump's commitment to blocking any significant action on climate change and the green transition, that severe disruption is imminent to the global economic system and domestic politics as well. So this is something that isn't in the distant future. This is something that is practically around the corner. And this is destined, unless something very significant is done in the relatively near future, to intensify the scramble for resources as well as trade and strategic locations. How long can we realistically expect that the neoliberal rules-based order can persist in the context of the very severe dislocations and crises that are bound to emerge with increasing intensity in the near future with the growing ecological pressures? So Trump has basically, in part, and those around him, cast aside Biden-esque illusions that the necessary action can be taken to avert catastrophe within the structure of neoliberal globalization. And he is betting that neither business nor any other part of society sees any plausible alternative to a tremendous expansion of American coercive power to seize the most important resources, trade routes, strategic positions on planet Earth before it's too late, and of course to contain rivals as well. I don't know. I think I'm probably almost out of time. Fred, how many minutes?
You're actually a bit over time, but
okay.
Maybe another minute and try to wrap it up, and we can continue the conversation for sure.
I think the key question that I want to raise, and I think why the declinist accounts, which rely on economism and instrumentalism, are so problematic, is what alternative does capital have to embracing a fundamental shift in the liberal democratic nature of the American state? And at what point do they decide that liberal democracy and the rules-based international order, which, as Camilo says, are linked, at what point does capital decide it's no longer worth it? They don't want democracy at home is no longer viable due to legitimation problems of global capitalism, and they don't want to share internationally, even with Europe, in the event that they don't have to. And I think that those impulses have a lot to do with what we're seeing from Trump in the recent period.
Okay. Steve Backman messaged me during this saying this is like having like 4 graduate lectures in a row. And it's, we'll do the best we can at absorbing it and discussing it, but it's really a great deal to chew over and think about. But I wonder if the 4 of you would like to converse among yourselves for a bit about some of these questions and just, speak up, or if that doesn't go anywhere, then we'll open it up to Q&A. But just to see if there's actually a roundtable involved here.
I actually wanted to ask a question of both Steve and Matt. with regard to the sort of formulation of crony capitalism, right? It's like it's a epithet that gets lobbed at particularly global South states, et cetera. But there is a way in which, when we're trying to understand the kind of structural logic of the capitalist state, and in that, for that reason, the kind of illogical moves that are being made here, that there is frequently a sort of, the decisions that get made are about the kind of immediate enrichment of Trump and the people around him, right? And that can be from tiny things like prediction markets, which we saw, sort of manipulating prediction markets, up to, various other smaller and less important fractions of capital. But, I'm thinking particularly of, defense contractors and the idea that the running of Venezuela was going to be done by these kind of security firms, and, Eric Prince is involved, et cetera. And so I wonder what you both think about that formulation and how we might put that into conversation with these broader questions about the structure of the capitalist state. Does it mean anything?
Matt, why don't you go first, because I rudely already overused my time.
Yeah, I think I mean, sadly, it's not a very complicated story, but yeah, I think it's pretty accurate. I did read an article, I'm forgetting exactly, but of course now with the invasion and the leverage that the US has over the Venezuelan state, there is now oil being sort of contracted out and sent to different US firms. Like, that's actually happening. And one of the firms I saw reported is one of the largest donors to the Trump campaign. So, like that, just like again, this sort of naked, corrupt stuff is just, it's like there's it's like masks are off, and um, but again, like I would have a hard time thinking that those types of relationships were really driving the actual decision, um, because it's very clear to me like they were preparing for this for like months, like this was like a long game, and it was clear they were kind of doing all this intelligence on Maduro's movements and his. So this was a game, and I think again, Steve was talking about unipolar and this and that. I think it's interesting. Very early, about a year ago, when Trump took office, Rubio actually did say we live in a multipolar world now, which is not something U.S. Leaders are prone to say ever. That is really strange, and it does make me think again, like they have this weird, very geographical desire to reassert their power over this hemisphere, and particularly over Latin America, while they're gonna accept Russia's control over Ukraine, and China asserting its powers in the ways that it wants to, but that they're gonna make sure they have the power here. Um, I know we're having a dialogue, and Steve can follow up, but I also, Christy, I've been really sort of wondering if all of Trump's bluster about taking out Petro. I mean, with the election so close, and also like a lot of the polls showing that Petro or his party is not likely to succeed. Like, do you think there's any chance of them still doing anything in Colombia given all that?
Before you answer, Christy,
Go
can I
ahead,
just say a word
please.
on crony
Yeah.
capitalism? Because I think this is actually a really critical. You're touching on a really critical issue here, which, as Matt said, obviously there is a crony capitalism element to Trump, whether it's the Bitcoin, that's going to enrich his friends or whatever. It's clearly a big something that's happening. And I just want to emphasize something that Matt said. I wouldn't use the term absolute autonomy because, of course, I think, as we've seen again and again, even if Trump's doing stuff that capital doesn't like, he gets disciplined when
Yeah.
the economic consequences of that.
You saw it today with the stock market in Greenland,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
Exactly. And you're seeing it again already. He said that he's no longer threatening military power, military force in order to seize Greenland. And he's not going to even use tariffs, apparently.
Right.
So I think, again and again, he's disciplined. But what has happened is he's claimed exceptional autonomy from capital, I think. And that's true. It's observable in the context of the tariffs, which obviously nobody wanted, right? The big thing about Trump is that he's revising the rules of empire in a way that no business ever asked for. And so he is clearly exercising a level of autonomy and a form of autonomy that we're not used to seeing. But at the same time, he's also aware that he has to build a base in big business. And so he's trying to pardon all kinds of white collar criminals who did financial crimes. He's trying to deregulate, everything possible in the most radical way in US history. He's trying to basically do everything he can to cultivate some support from big business. But of course, as compensation for the other stuff he's doing, which they don't like very much. So I think crony capitalism is part of it, but I still think that, it's the overall picture is one of a president that is claiming exceptional autonomy in the context of a political crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would just say with regard to Colombia, I really, I don't think that there is a strategy in which he tries to, arrest arrest Petro while he's the sitting president. But we might see, depending on the outcome of the election, right? We might see some sort of one of the things that has been very clear in the fascist international that Steve mentioned, or Matt, I can't remember which of you it was the extent to which they are, and this was reported, in depth today, but the extent to which the Trump administration is outsourcing a kind of particular version of fascist lawfare. And we saw this with the kind of close connection with Bolsonaro. We're seeing it in Europe as well. And so there are ways in which the kind of Trump fascist axis is trying to weaponize the legal system against perceived kind of leftist, the leftist attempts to sort of encase the economy in their countries from the intervention of these kinds of movements. And so I think we'll continue to see that kind of thing playing out, even if it's not the same sort of like boots on the ground military intervention. I think we're going to continue to see the building of these networks that attempt to use legal frameworks to basically make it so that left outcomes of elections are never possible.
Camilo, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Christy just said and sort of the points that were raised about the Colombian elections. Right now, the immediate effect of the intervention in Venezuela on the Colombian electorate was to strengthen Cepeda, the leftist candidate. And like Christy mentioned, there was a similar effect in Mexico. Again, there are exceptions to the regional trend that Christy also pointed out.
Which is like, when would we ever think that in the history of Latin America that Mexico and Colombia are the leftist exceptions to what's going on in the rest of Latin? It's like sort of mind-blowing that we really are truly through the looking glass right now.
Unfortunately, they're the outliers, right? But significant outliers. But I guess what I was going to say is that, speaking of lawfare, we saw what went down with the Honduran elections, the way in which Trump flipped them, right? Bottom line, there was fraud. And that was very significant regionally, and because Honduras was beginning to go in the other direction, right? So there's real foreboding in Colombia and in Brazil. Those are the two big elections coming up, as again Christy already pointed out, and so there's a lot of concern about that, especially as it becomes clearer that there's sort of kind of a backfire from what happened in Venezuela. Cepeda gets stronger. It looks more and more like maybe he might win, despite the fact that Petro was actually losing ground up until the Venezuela intervention. But in effect, the Venezuela intervention, the way we say it in Spanish is le dio la razón a Petro. In other words, Petro looks really good in terms of his radicalism in the wake, no matter how much he may have muted his own radicalism, as was described sort of anecdotally. And depending maybe on how he does in the Oval Office, there's been this comparison, Colombian analysts have sort of compared how it went with Zelensky on the one hand and how it went with Mamdani on the other, and which way will Petro go? Let's see. But the bottom line is Cepeda is a much more, I don't know how to say it in English, someone much more balanced in many ways, equanime, like somebody who's much more level-headed, let's say, as a leader and in terms of what he projects in terms of left leadership, a lot of it because of his own history. Cepeda has a very deep history. This is the left candidate currently in Colombia, as a leader of the victims of human rights violations. His own father was a victim of political murder, assassination in Colombia. So anyhow, he kind of embodies the sort of frustrated hopes of the peace process in Colombia, which is still pending. So just, just a little footnote about that. The other thing is Brazil is by no means assured Lula's victory. By no means, of course, Bolsonaro is the pending threat. He may be in jail. His son is apparently the heir apparent, the Trump Jr., right? And so, but lawfare is going to play a very important role in terms of the machinations, let's say, of the electoral process, right? And the manipulations that may come. But the other thing in terms of blowback, I think in terms of like imperial blowback, is I have been really struck. If you think about the Renee Nicole Good case, I've been mostly watching that from here and with colleagues in Latin America. I'm talking about folks in Brazil, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, not just in Mexico, where there might be a more immediate ripple effect. And I have been struck, in all these years of doing work on both sides of the border and doing transnational work, I have never seen such a heightened sense as people on this side from the South watch what's happening in the US. It had always been a struggle before, when I was based in the US, to get people's attention about migrant rights issues, because it was like, yeah, fine, but really the issue is imperialism. So it's the reverse problem we have in the US of getting people's attention about imperialism, right? If you understand me, there's a double blindness, from each side. And so that's what we have to fight on both sides. The polls are stunning in the US about the percentage of the population that has seen the Renee Nicole Good, what we would call in Latin America, and from an international law perspective, an extrajudicial execution, right? A public execution. The number of human rights defenders in Latin America who have seen that video and understand it that way, and see her as a human rights defender who was killed because she was a human rights defender doing that work. That's not how she's, all this, Renee Nicole Good, American mom stuff, right? With all due respect, that's not the important thing. She was a citizen, civilian observer acting in solidarity, and she was killed because of that. That's very deeply understood in Latin America from the perspective of the persecution of human rights defenders. So it's just flipping the framework around. I guess I just wanted to share that different way of framing these issues. It's the way, for example, in the US, we've come to understand the crimes of the Trump administration. Those migrants put on those flights on March 15 to Secot in El Salvador, right, as cases of forced disappearances. This is language that the US is not accustomed to. But in Latin America, this is bread and butter. We have a lot more to learn from each other.
Okay, Camilo, thank you. I think we programmed this to go to 9 p.m., which it now is, but I think there's so much on the table and so much of our audience has not had a chance to pose questions or comments. I think we can, if it's all right with everyone, we'll go another half hour or up to another half hour.
I'm sorry to say that I have to leave, but thank you all so much for inviting me.
Christy, thank you so much, and
thank you.
Hope to see you again
And
before
if folks
long.
have particular questions, if they want to talk about things, please reach out to me. You can find me on the NYU website, and I'm very available. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
Ciao.
So let me now open the speaker stack to questions and comments from our audience. You can type the word stack in the Zoom chat and I'll put you on the stack, or you can use the Zoom button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, or you can wave and hold up your hand and try to get my attention. So whatever works for you. So, anyone?
Well, I could just talk for another half hour. That's fine.
Everyone is, like me, trying to absorb all of this. Herman, please go ahead.
Yeah, somebody mentioned early on about Canada. Yeah, what do the people that have spoken think about Trump's actual intentions towards Canada, and what are people saying in terms of the progressive community in the United States, other than being angry about the way he talks about it, in terms of the Canadian actually necessity of breaking with the U.S. in different ways. You notice that the Prime Minister spoke in Davos about elements. He alluded to the end of the rules-based stuff and all that's in middle power, but it didn't really talk about changing the structure of the economy and what you'd have to fight for and what would have to be different. I'd like to know how people down there see this and how you see that in terms of what should be the relationship with Canada. I don't mean just diplomatically, I mean in terms of the economy.
Well, Mark Carney's comments I found to be, deeply ironic because, of course, Canada has long been, the leading uh, force in the world system, pushing for this, and legitimating the American empire by providing a veil of humanitarian uh, legitimacy for U.S. warfare in various different contexts, including literally sending people, and has it's sending soldiers, and has been, for a very, very long period of time now. Uh, Effectively, its main role has been to create this sense of multilateralism to justify whatever the U.S. wants to do. And so, Mark Carney saying we've always known the rules-based international order was a lie. I found that to be deeply ironic. Um, and of course, it's rich for Canada to say that when you have, Iran getting bombed, Palestine, a genocide in Palestine. He had nothing to say about any of that stuff, of course. Um, and his solution, Carney's solution for this was to reassert multilateralism and to reassert a kind of like a classic consensus style, humanitarian, uh, just and enlightened Western imperialism as part of a coalition. So, I thought that, and he was almost pitching it specifically so that it would end up in a uh, international relations textbook, in 10 years. And so, responsibility to protect and all that garbage, Canada has been the leading force pushing all that. And I feel like that was really more than anything, Carney reasserting those very same principles more than breaking with them.
Just a technical note, I put in the chat our,
I agree with you, Steve, by the way.
pardon me, Herman. I just wanted to bring people's attention to what I put in the chat, the recording policy of the Marxist Education Project, which we should have noted earlier. But if you do choose to appear in the video and make comments, that you are effectively giving us permission to use it on YouTube if the speakers agree. So I hope that doesn't deter anyone.
I'm just reinforcing that I believe I agree with what Steve said. I'd be interested to see what some other folks that haven't looked at this as closely as Steve has, because he's been in both places. And yes.
I do see Victor's question in the chat about Venezuelan oil as a weapon against China. If I remember correctly, Venezuelan oil makes up something like 4% of China's imports, which is not that big. So I don't think it's a major factor. But I do think, again, they do have presence in Venezuela, and the assertion of U.S. power against that presence is a factor. But the oil itself, I think, is somewhat negligible from China's overall perspective. And of course, China is, some have argued, already reached peak oil demand and is rapidly building out their electric vehicle fleet so that as their own kind of desire to reduce their dependence on oil imports entirely. So, but again, China's all over Latin America. They're invested in trading in Brazil and pretty much every country. So that it's also, I think, not plausible that this action in Venezuela is really gonna harm them significantly because they have so much connections all over the continent.
Okay, David.
I also had a question regarding oil for Matt. From what I understand, the president of Mexico is going to cancel all the oil contracts with U.S. corporations. What kind of implication would that have for our relationship with Mexico?
Yeah, I have not seen that. That's interesting.
Mm.
I mean, Mexico, of course, is one of the original countries to really attack a U.S. and other international oil capital when they nationalized the oil in 1938, which was one of the, really great moment of the assertion of popular power against oil capital on the world stage, right? And since then, the national oil company, Pemex, has been the major player in their oil industry, and they kind of reversed and tried to privatize parts of it recently, but now Morena is trying to reassert the importance of the public oil company and so forth. So, but and also this again, it's not. I don't know a ton about this, but the fact that they have now been sending oil to Cuba is something interesting that's also going on here. But as Christy pointed out, I think they're also trying to placate Trump in all these different ways, particularly around the drug stuff. So it's a tightrope that they're walking.
My understanding was that they were getting financial aid from China and also engineering help from Russia to do the drilling and stuff. So anyway, just wanted to hear your comment. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Or we can go back to
Camilo, do you want to
Camilo?
jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to come.
Camilo, can I ask you a question? I really want to ask you a question. One of the things that has come up that I've seen is this idea that so when Trump is designating this as a war, he's calling it a non-international armed conflict. So it's an international conflict that is not between states, and he's calling drugs, weapons of mass destruction. I really want to hear your take on what you think the implications of that are for domestic politics in terms of his obviously concerted effort to expand his role as commander in chief over domestic politics and expand the role of the military in domestic politics.
Okay, Kate also has her hand up. Let's take Kate and then Camilo, if we can. We'll get to Steve's question, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have two disparate questions. My first one is about Brazil, and I'm wondering whether, in all our discussion about lawfare, whether the power of the Supreme Court to put Bolsonaro in jail and to have leverage within the country and support the government is something for us to hold on to with some hope and with some appreciation. That may be a question that I wish I had directed at Christy, but my other question is, and I know morality is not our key issue here, but how do we look at the kinds of corruption that are taking place within the Trump administration and interpret them from a more political Marxist perspective? I don't know how better to say that, but perhaps you can help me shape that better. Thank you.
Go ahead, Camilo.
Yeah, just something quickly. I mean, about Canada, China, and Mexico, just really, really quick. Canada and China are notorious in Latin America for their extractivist policies. So I think there may be a misunderstanding about that, I think, in the US on the left. But I think if you look at this from the perspective of indigenous movements and eco-socialist movements in Latin America, they have a very critical perspective about the impact of Chinese investment in Latin America, by and large, in infrastructure, and Canadian investment for sure. Canadian nickel mining, for example, in places like Guatemala is notorious. So again, just to put another spin on it. So to think of China as a serious liberatory alternative from the perspective of Latin American popular movements is not taken seriously by most grassroots social movements in Latin America. So just we have that in our mind. As far as I know, in Mexico, it would be anathema at this moment for the Sheinbaum government to turn to Russian and Chinese technicians in the oil industry, because that would be exactly the kind of thing that would provoke further anger and pressure from the US. So if that was ever on the table, it may have been at some point. It's not now. And if anything, what has intensified is Mexican dependence on the US. I think Christy alluded to this. And that has included, and here again, I think there's a tremendous misunderstanding among the left in the US and among the left globally that thinks of the Sheinbaum government as a left government in a way that is very uncritical and does not understand important nuances. I will underline that in the following way. If it were not for cooperation from the current government in Mexico, the Sheinbaum government, and the previous one of López Obrador, who are sometimes held up as kind of left heroes, there would not be the kind of persecution and terror that there is on the ground in Mexico today against migrants in transit. In effect, the US has transferred the persecution of migrants from US territory to Mexican territory. And it's done that with the active cooperation and complicity of Mexico's so-called left governments. So Mexico has to be held accountable for that. And betraying a long-standing tradition of Mexico, of course, being a country of origin, one of the most important countries of origin of migrants in the world. So, I mean, it's very complex on the ground here in Mexico. And the other thing is very significant continuing human rights violations, cases of massive abuses, mass disappearances like Ayotzinapa, the 43 students in Guerrero, and other important massacres that the current government and the previous government, and of course, the prior right-wing governments have never done anything to address. So don't think of Sheinbaum as a leftist government in the same sense in which you might have thought of the Chavez government, for example, in Venezuela. There are very important differences. As to Brazil, yes, the Supreme Court in Brazil is a tremendous bulwark in terms of rule of law. The Bolsonaro case is a very important precedent. And the Brazilian constitution, because it's a constitution that was forged to help Brazil make a transition to democracy after dictatorship, after a fascist military dictatorship, the Brazilian constitution is very resilient in the face of authoritarianism. That's why Bolsonaro is in jail. But let's remember that Lula was in jail too, and in jail unjustly. So, it can cut both ways. The legal system can cut both ways, as we know. But it is a good sign. The Supreme Court has been a source of hope in Brazil. Let's see what happens with the elections.
Okay, let's take Diliana. Hope I said that right.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. My question is about Venezuela. Does any of you have information about the state of the legacy of the socialist revolution? And in Venezuela at the moment, how much support there is for this legacy? Are people interested in Venezuela in reviving a left anti-capitalist project? What is happening there? Thank you.
Camilo, do you want to take that?
Yeah, and I'm going to sort of take a deep breath before I do, because there may be a lot of disagreement about this. I don't know. I think a lot of people on the left in the U.S. think that in order to denounce U.S. intervention and invasion and abuse, and because all of that is true, the crimes that were committed by the U.S. with this intervention in Venezuela, that means we have to defend the Maduro regime. And I think many of us in Latin America think that there's a difference between denouncing U.S. imperialism and defending Maduro. Now, that doesn't mean, for example, we have to emphasize that Maduro is somebody who was kidnapped illegally, and that the case against him in New York is a case that is completely trumped up, I use the term deliberately, and that he should be released. He's entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war. He's been denied due process. He and his wife were beaten and mistreated in the process. They should be freed. They're political prisoners. But that is not the same as defending his regime. And there has to be a differentiation. And there's no reason for us as principled solidarity activists to confuse the two things. So there's really well-founded reasons to question also the assumption that the Chavez legacy and Maduro are the same thing. There's a lot of evidence on the ground and voices of Venezuelans on the ground who draw a distinction between Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro. And so when you refer to that legacy of socialist revolution and Bolivarian revolution, I would say that's much more associated with Hugo Chavez and not with Nicolás Maduro, and that we should draw that distinction. And if you ask, I think, people on the ground in Venezuela, you will hear that there's certainly a vigorous debate about this, and that we need to understand that on the left, because there's a lot at stake in how we move forward from this point.
I can jump in, and I want to make clear I'm not an expert on Venezuela, but there is an oil angle here where you could say Chavez was a bit lucky to come into power just before a major commodity boom, super cycle, whatever you want to call it, and really presided over this really massive increase of oil prices in the aughts. And I think that gave his regime a lot of a degree of freedom that many global South countries don't enjoy, and because of all those all that oil money and rents. And I think in terms of legacy, like I think it's actually really inspiring. You know, obviously, if you're a good capitalist oil company, you're supposed to accumulate capital and reinvest in the oil industry. I think he took a lot of that money and redistributed it into real grassroots programs and kind of like lifted people out of poverty in a dramatic scale. And so it was a really incredible way in which a lot of that oil money was used for popular development in ways that's not common in global capitalism. Um, and it is kind of stark though that he did pass away just before that oil boom really did crash out, and Maduro then presided over a collapse of the oil prices, and of course this had political reverberations. I think it had a big impact on the PT in Brazil as well to have the commodity prices go down, and but I think to Camilo's point, I think we can't just let the Maduro regime completely off the hook. I think there was some pretty severe economic mismanagement and corruption on top of this oil price crash. And it seems also clear, like in terms of, you know, there probably could have been a little more rational investment in the oil sector because it's basically collapsed in the last particularly decade. You know, if you look at Fred's list of readings, Adam Hanai's piece talks about how a decade ago Venezuela refined a quarter of Latin America's oil, and now it's down to like 6%. So the refinery sector has collapsed. Now they're forced to import refined products, even though they're producing crude oil at home. So. And I think we also have to be clear that Chavez's politics was pretty popular, and there was this massive base for Chavista type of politics. But I think if we're being sober, like we have to confront that Maduro's base has severely declined, and there's not a huge popular base. And as Christy pointed out, there was some degree of popular welcoming and celebration of this event. I think a lot of people that dissipated when they realized the Maduro regime is still in place pretty much entirely. So anyway, it's complicated, but it's hard. It's hard to build socialism on commodity prices, particularly on oil prices. It's just not a stable platform to build socialism. But I will say Chavez did some pretty inventive and interesting things on the upswing of that commodity price boom.
Okay, we're approaching 9:30 on the East Coast, and I think we need to wrap things up unless any of the panelists would like to make any final quick comments. Otherwise, thank you so much, Matt, Steve, Camilo, and I'll extend our thanks to Christy by email shortly. And please keep an eye on the Marxist Education Project website at www.marxedproject.org for future events. Coming up on February 25th, and very relevant to this topic as well, will be a talk by Thea Riofrancos on her recent book, Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. So in some ways, we can continue aspects of this conversation with Thea in a month. So meanwhile, thanks again, and